This. Oh, that's nice. I've got sounds happening. All of this. Hi, good morning. My name's Allison Ashcroft. I'm coming to you today from the Lekwungen territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations here in Victoria, British Columbia. And I'm going to start off with a little quick bit of housekeeping before we introduce our speakers today and the purpose of our webinar. First, you're probably going to notice the production quality of this webinar is a titch higher than our normal CUSP offers. And that's because we have the folks from Google's digital team running this live stream from Google's platform. What this also means is that today isn't as much of a peer discussion as we normally have. So unfortunately, we won't be able to unmute phone lines today, but we do have a Q&A after the presentations, and we'll collect your questions throughout the hour. So please type them into the question form that you should be able to see on the right of your screen. So today we're talking about digital innovation and data visualization. And those who know me know that I'm a little bit obsessed, maybe, with spatial data to create energy and emissions maps, and also more recently to create energy justice maps for better understanding and acting on equity and energy poverty. But I'm not into tech tools for tech's sake. I'm a big believer in digital innovation that enables cities to save time, make data-informed choices, and use these visualizations to compel administration and council, and also to activate their business and community. So we need to work in new ways and to accelerate and scale outcomes and impact. And I think tools and data mining like those we're going to see today and talk about need to be fully embraced, but they also need to be designed for purpose too. So conversations like this are necessary to increase the awareness for cities of what tools are out there for them to use, but also for the software developers to better understand the users and the uses they're designing for. We're going to talk specifically about how data visualization can be used for public engagement, what's needed for it to be also used for our policy and program design, and then looking ahead, how might we come to rely on data and digital tools for evaluating performance and measuring impact. We're showcasing how the City of Edmonton is embracing data visualization in its energy transition strategy today. And Edmonton is the first city in Canada to use MyHEAT's solar maps. So we've brought James Henry into the conversation today, and he will be speaking with Lisa Dockman, the city's energy transition manager. Maybe you can throw up the slide, thanks. Following that discussion, Nicole Lombardo will show us the latest and greatest reveals from Google's Environmental Insights Explorer, which I, for one, am really looking forward to figuring out how to mine that more actively for CUSP and its member cities. So I'll be talking with the Google team and our members to figure out what that might look like in the coming months. But kicking off this morning, sitting next to me on that slide is Mark Brostrom. And kicking off this morning, I want to start with why are we doing this? What are the City of Edmonton's goals and needs? And why are they learning or leaning into digital tools like these? That's what we're going to talk about today. And so for that broader view, I'm going to invite Mark Brostrom to join me now. He's the Director of Sustainability at the City of Edmonton and a municipal veteran in climate action, if I'm allowed to say that, in this progressive city. So Mark, let's get straight into it. In August 2019, Edmonton's Mayor and Council declared a climate emergency and directed staff to update the energy transition strategy. That's Edmonton's community mitigation plan, for those of you not aware or as familiar with that plan. That plan, you've been directed to accelerate that timeline and ambition of the plan in order to reduce Edmonton's fair share of global greenhouse gases. So last week's plan update was released, if anybody wants to go take a look at it online. And in 2 weeks, you go before council to present it and seek their adoption. So talk to me, what is Edmonton's plan for meeting the ambitious greenhouse gas targets that Mayor and Council have asked you to have set for you? And specifically for the topic of today's discussion, what are the strategies you're using for shifting to renewables and retrofitting homes?
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack there, but yeah, I mean, I think the short answer to the question of what our goals are at the city level is and I think a lot of cities are having these conversations, but basically we're looking to move to a net zero community by 2050, and within that, though, there is also the question of the carbon budget and what we can emit into the atmosphere globally, and bringing that down to the local level and saying we've got a certain budget that we have within our community boundaries, and so that's the sort of, I guess, the short answer on that. The real challenge I think that becomes on this is to say you talked about my veteran status in the climate file, and it's true. It's been decades that we've been working on this file and probably have not advanced things as quickly as we should have, or needed to from a global perspective. So I think the urgency is a big challenge in this, and we look at the carbon budget and saying we don't have very much room in the global atmosphere for carbon, and we're quickly eroding our ability to do that. So that's probably the biggest challenge on this piece. Now, getting into how we're going to do that, it's probably very similar with both cities. Well, we're looking at the renewable side. We're looking at a low carbon city, so the planning side and the transportation side of things. We are looking at carbon capture and nature-based solutions. Those types of things are important. And emission neutral buildings is sort of where a lot of this work fits into here. So again, looking at opportunities to build emission neutral buildings from the start. So whether that's our new homes or building, commercial buildings, all of that type of thing. And probably the bigger challenge right now is on the retrofit side of things. How do we retrofit the hundreds of thousands of homes and buildings that we have in our cities to that emission neutral standard, and bringing in the renewable side of things. So again, that's solar and that type of thing. So without getting into too deep a dive into this, one of our key approaches is sort of to incentivize our retrofit side of things and incentivize our solar program. So we can have more conversations on that later.
Cool. Thank you. So just for those who aren't as familiar with Edmonton, Edmonton's a city of about close to 1 million. So it's one of our bigger cities in Canada. It's probably our top 5 cities in terms of its population. So it is a big challenge, specifically with the retrofitted buildings. The city is also the first in Canada to include a carbon budget in its municipal development plan. So there's many more Canadian cities who are in the process of establishing that carbon budget, but the City of Edmonton actually put theirs out in November of 2019. So it's a real leader in that department as well. So cities like Edmonton and its neighboring city in Alberta, Calgary, both whose economies have been tethered to oil and gas, have been hit hard economically, and that was well before COVID. And again, for those who aren't as familiar with Alberta, we're talking about a quarter of all of the downtown commercial space in Calgary being vacant for the last couple of years, and at least a quarter of all Albertans have been out of work during 2020 and have had to access and rely on the Canada Emergency Response Benefit or employment insurance benefits. So how is climate action, Mark, being positioned with economic recovery in Edmonton and the swift and just transition from the fossil fuel energy sector, which you've historically been so reliant on?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that historically, or even some of our previous energy plans that aren't as we've increased the ambition on this plan significantly as far as moving forward, but we've tended to sort of downplay the economic side of things in previous plans. But this time around, with COVID, with the as Allison, you've mentioned, the energy prices, the challenges around the economy in the Alberta context and the Edmonton context, we flipped that around and really upplayed that piece. Upplayed is not the right words, but so the plan, is very frank, and we identified that to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. We've modeled that we need $42 billion worth of investment within the city, and we sort of are framing that as that the bad news is we need $42 billion worth of investment, and the good news is that we're going to it's going to catalyze $42 billion of investment from an economic development perspective. And of course, a lot of that is into the, it's across the entire sectors, but a lot of that will be on the building side of things. And some of the incremental cost in net zero buildings, but the retrofit side of things, adding the renewable energy piece to this, and particularly in the Edmonton context, solar, whether that's on ground mount or roof mount, all of those types of things. So again, pivoting that and looking at a good opportunity for investment, a decent return on investment on these pieces, is a way to sort of post-COVID economic recovery pieces in the Alberta context, in the Edmonton context.
Yeah, right. Okay, I'll ask you one last question, just to set us up for our colleagues' discussion to follow. So, Edmonton was the first city to use MyHEAT for their solar maps, and that's what we're going to showcase today. But you're really, Edmonton's a leader in digital innovation overall amongst our Canadian cities. So I'm guessing there's some folks inside the city who maybe share my obsession with data and data visualization. Why do you think Edmonton has embraced data and technology so fully, particularly in the area of mapping climate and energy? Is this like embedded in your organizational culture, or generated through fostered partnerships with academia, or how has this come about?
That's a really good question, and one I should know the answer to, being with the city for a long period of time. It's interesting, because I would sort of, my take on this is say, well, isn't that the way people do business? Isn't that the way cities operate? And with an engineering background, that makes sense to me. But I do think it's sort of something that's culturally come through the city. A lot of work. We have a very significant open city data platform, provide a lot of information and data out there. And it hasn't hurt that for the past few terms, we've had a councillor and our current mayor who is an absolute geek on these types of things. So he does really understand the need for data, for evidence, for science-based decisions. This was embedded in the Edmonton Declaration that was created a couple of years ago with the city's IPCC conference that we hosted here, and it reflects basically to the point where we have a carbon budget. We've done a number of things that are really based on that science end of things. And of course, to do that, then you need good information, good data, whether it's on your inventory work or just again, whether it's on the visualization, understanding where you're at, and understanding where you can go as you move forward. So I think that's been sort of the culture that we've had here. And I think it's really helped us out in moving to these very challenging and difficult decisions and discussions that we need to have in a number of areas, but particularly in the climate file that I'm embedded in.
Yeah.
Anyways,
pretty fortunate to have Mayor Iverson in Edmonton being such a strong climate leader on the nationally on representing large cities. So why don't you introduce? Let's kick it off.
I will do that. And just on a sad note, I will mention that Mayor Iverson is not running again for City Council, so that runs over. But I'm going to introduce my colleague, Lisa Dockman, who is going to talk about MyHEAT. I'll leave it at that.
Super. Thanks, Mark. Lisa, did you want to kick off with an introduction?
Sure. So yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for joining. Lisa Dockman. I work with the City of Edmonton on the energy transition team, and I'm responsible for the residential suite of programs.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, thanks for attending. I'm James Henry. I'm the Director of Growth and Sustainability at MyHEAT. And so I'm really pleased to be here today to have this discussion and build off that great intro set by Allison and Mark. My background, actually I spent 8 years at Google just until recently. So lots of friends in the background who are helping to pull together this webinar today, which is great. And for the last couple of years, while I was at Google, I was supporting a variety of Google's environmental sustainability initiatives, including Project Sunroof, which is Google's sort of rooftop solar insights platform, as well as the Environmental Insights Explorer, which we'll learn more about today from Nicole, who's on the line as well. So, I actually came to know the MyHEAT team while I was working at Google. So Lisa and I have only gotten to know each other since I joined MyHEAT about 6 months ago. But having sort of led the Project Sunroof side on the Google side, rather, MyHEAT is all about energy made visible, and I sort of became infatuated with that. And having met the team, having worked with them, I was really excited to kind of jump over and see if I could sort of switch from being behind the scenes on the Google side to really being at the forefront and bringing data and bringing insights and bringing this kind of technology to a wider array of municipalities in Canada and albeit around the world. So MyHEAT's specialty is actually in thermal infrared heat loss mapping for municipalities and cities around the world. But for today, the focus of our conversation will be on solar. So Lisa, maybe just a couple questions to kick off the conversation here and contextualize some of what Mark was alluding to in the introduction. As a sort of on the ground practitioner in the role that you do, I think you'll have great insight to share with the folks on the call today. So, in your opinion, what do you think that cities need for the development of climate policies and programs, and how does data and data visualizations help to achieve this? What are the tools that you're using today that we need today, and what are the tools that maybe don't yet exist that we need for the future?
Yeah, such a good question. And I think it looks like I probably would agree with Allison and Mark that data visualizations play just a really important role, as they can help inform municipal decision making, as well as sort of on a broader scale, as well as program and policy specific design choices. So really valuable in a lot of ways. I think something that's interesting about the area we work in is a lot of the interventions that are necessary to achieve our climate change goals are known, and they've been demonstrated in other municipalities and other nations. And so we really have a lot of lessons to learn from others. But to be the most successful, these programs and policies, they must be place-based, and they must be tailored specifically to the community. And this is where I think data plays a critical role, is to ensure that evidence-based decision-making and that our programs and policies are effective in our local context. So for example, as Mark mentioned, and Allison, we have our updated community energy transition strategy awaiting to be approved. That's in alignment with the Paris Agreement's ambition. And that work required a lot of research to understand the potential GHGs of certain actions and levers in our municipality. And from what I've heard from my colleagues is the environmental impacts explorer was very valuable, super helpful to kind of corroborate our research, especially around the solar potential of our municipality, how many rooftops could have solar installed on them, and what the sort of great potential would be of all those combined. But I would say sort of your question about future, I do think that some of these visualizations, especially today, have limitations from my perspective. So I think sometimes they're not based on real data. They're maybe based on assumptions and then also models, and which certainly is helpful. But from my perspective as a project manager, the most valuable data visualizations can be based on data sets like energy consumption from buildings, the utility companies, and whether it be natural gas or electricity, that kind of real, on the ground consumption pieces. And then another might be like building stock assessments. The enormity of the challenge of renovating all of the homes and buildings in our cities, really understanding the state of those buildings, the renovations that have taken place, the equipment that's within them, is super helpful for program and policy development. So I kind of hope that that's, that data can be accessed by folks in the future to make those kinds of things readily available.
Yeah, that's a good point, that distinction between data, tools, and insights that we have today versus, what ideally we would like in the future. I think we'll probably always straddle the line between, fact-based, evidence-based data that we can use to turn that into insights and action, and then supplementing those gaps with modeling, with assumptions. And I think we'll see a little bit more of that toward the end with Google's EIE data. I think, as I understand it, for Canada, data sets that you mentioned, Lisa, energy consumption within buildings is something that you typically can partner with local utilities to obtain. But on the transportation side, it's maybe a little bit harder to assess that. And that's where, assumptions and models, the likes of which Google can provide, can be really valuable. So I think we'll always straddle that line for some time. So maybe just to move on to considering, how, we just kind of briefly talked about how data, tools, and platforms can be used to inform policies, programs, to corroborate findings, to really try and identify the lowest hanging fruit. But that's all well and good to start with, to understand that baseline. But I think you really have to then use data to engage a broader group of people. And as someone who works for the City of Edmonton, I'm quite curious about how that comes to life with engaging the public. So, in your opinion, sort of, why is it important to engage the public when working for the city using these insights? And it would be great if you can demonstrate some examples of how the City of Edmonton is successful in engaging the public with regard to climate action.
Sure. I thought I heard a bit of feedback when I was talking last. Did you hear that as well? Is there an adjustment we should maybe make, or do you think it's okay?
I didn't hear it on my side.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so I think that's a really good question too. So, data can be incredibly powerful, but only if it can be readily understood by whoever is engaging with that information, right? So I think visualizations play an important role in communicating the messages from that data in an accessible way. And that is how data relates to public engagement from my perspective. So most of our climate policies and programs are targeting human behavior changes. So whether that be residents, or if it's maybe institutions and businesses, though how those organizations are making decisions. And so providing provocative and powerful information to those people and organizations can help inspire action. And I think that's really where this sort of engagement piece comes in. But of course, we know that that doesn't work for everybody. But as the energy transition is underway, those visualizations, I think, do provide that opportunity for people to integrate that evidence into their decision making. So yeah, so since 2018, I think a really great example of a visualization for public engagement has had added value to the city's work is working with MyHEAT, as was described, to provide a solar potential map for all Edmontonians. And we first started this in 2018. And I think I would talk about maybe two major benefits of this tool. I think first, it plays an important role in myth busting. So we know that a lot of Edmontonians do not think solar makes sense in Edmonton for whatever reasons. I think we hear that people think it's super cold, which it is. That's not very helpful. Or for example, the days are really short in the winter. So how could that make sense? But the reality is that Edmonton has really great solar potential. So better than places like Berlin or Tokyo or like Toronto as example. And just sort of like fun facts, like from what I understand, electrical equipment works better in these colder temperatures, and the longer summer days result in really good performance in the summer and shoulder seasons. So really, this tool is a great opportunity to showcase that and to myth bust for Edmontonians. And then I think related to that, a really great benefit of it is that it inspires Edmontonians to go solar now and to take advantage of our incentive to install rooftop solar on their homes. So those who are intrigued or contemplating, which I think a lot of people are aware of solar, they see it on their neighbor's rooftop, they're contemplating, and this kind of tool is meant to kind of push them over the edge. So it's sophisticated enough that it helps them get like, kind of like just get a taste of what they could do, and then hopefully go to the next steps and pursue, the rebate list of qualified installers and taking that action on their home. So I think in 2020, even though we've had this map since 2018 with MyHEAT, it was really dramatically changed in 2020 with the added value of the Google Earth data. So I think maybe it's a good time, James, to pop into the demonstration, or?
Yeah, well, a quick comment or two just before that. I mean, I think a few things that you mentioned were really interesting. You mentioned changing behaviors, changing human behavior, which is really, really hard, right? And really kind of thinking about how data can be utilized in a way that does encourage people to either learn more or actually sort of take the next steps. And one of the ways that you can change human behavior is making it easy to understand, as you said, right? Making something, turning maybe complex data sets into something that's really, really visually sort of easy to understand and comprehend from the get-go. And I think the second sort of most powerful thing that you can do to change human behavior is incentivize it. So, Mark alluded to this at the beginning, you've alluded to it now again. We'll see a little bit more of that in the demo, but certainly incentivizing folks, particularly from a financial perspective, is a powerful motivator. Need to change human behavior at scale as well, for sure. Yeah, so now's probably a good time for us to pivot over to a sort of demonstration of the platform. So we can give folks a look and feel as to what this is, how it works for the City of Edmonton, and really speak to some of the factors that were built in to encourage the behavior change that's sort of required. So what you should be seeing now is the homepage for MyHEAT's solar map. And so again, MyHEAT is all about energy made visible. And so in this case, this is really visualizing millions of rooftops in cities around the world and demonstrating their solar potential. So, we've built this in partnership with Google, powered by Google's Project Sunroof, from which we derive the rooftop attributes and the solar irradiance attributes and sort of visualize it with Google satellite imagery as well. So there's a couple of really powerful layers in there that we've built on top of, but in a way that we think is quite simple and easy to understand. So we'll jump right into the Edmonton site, and you'll notice it looks very similar to Google Maps, with the exception of these colors on the screen. So, what we're seeing here, this blue line is sort of the municipal boundary of Edmonton. And all of those sort of orange and darker sort of purple squares is the solar potential map to every building. So we'll get to that in a second. But Lisa, did you want to sort of, as we're going through this, maybe just talk through a couple of these features? And so maybe talk to us about what we're seeing here with the municipal boundary, but with some of these areas that are sitting outside of Edmonton's boundary.
Yeah, I think there's like a couple interesting things about this perspective on the map. Like, one is a definite advantage. So given the data sets that MyHEAT works with is, you'll see that it's outside. There's information from outside Edmonton's municipal boundaries. And so really climate change knows no borders, right? So there is this added value of us being able to have cities like St. Albert or Sherwood Park access some of that solar performance information as part of our work with MyHEAT. But I think also similarly, something that's a challenge is you'll see as we've annexed land and Edmonton has grown, those like north and southern parts have no data. And granted, they have pretty low population density comparatively, but as you're repurposing the data that's available, that's just wasn't collected as part of that process for, I'm sure, some very good reasons because of low population and whatnot. But it also shows sort of an opportunity, but also then like a future, hopefully, improvements.
Yeah, that's a great call out, those northern and southern areas with little data. So it's maybe a good point to mention that the data that really powers Project Sunroof and powers this solar map is collected by Google for ultimately a different purpose, primarily for Google Maps and building 3D models of larger urban areas. So we've got our Google friends on the call today. So hopefully they're hearing that as Edmonton's boundary grows, there's definitely a desire to expand the coverage there for sure. So let's pull up a quick address and we can sort of demonstrate how the platform works and talk about some kind of interesting insights from this particular address. So very quickly, we've sort of zoned into a particular rooftop. And so I'll briefly talk about what you're seeing and then ask Lisa to expand on this. You're seeing a lot of rooftop buildings here with essentially the solar potential, the solar radiance mapped to the boundary of that rooftop, with a shading scale that indicates how bright or how shady the area of the rooftop is. So sort of a bright yellow like you see to these houses toward the top of the screen indicates, in this case, that's a south-facing roof. In the northern hemisphere, that's getting a lot of bright solar radiance throughout the day. There's no sort of obstacles nearby casting shade. But these houses sort of to the bottom of the screen, they're actually sort of darker orange, more purple, so there's not as much sunlight hitting those. So we'll dive into that in a second. But Lisa, one of the things we've built in is even at this very first step to the platform, we've built in this addition of information here to let folks sort of know that, really this is the City of Edmonton bringing this platform to them. This is part of the Change for Climate program and providing some early information up front. So maybe you could kind of expand on, how this is helpful when presenting these insights to folks visiting this site for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think also just sort of interest, this is actually my house that I'm in right now that James has brought up. As you can see, when this was taken, the previous owner had an incredible garden. So I'm sure you'll notice as we get a little bit closer. But yeah, you'll notice that I live in an older, mature neighborhood with a tree-lined street, and that really impacts the solar potential of the home. Which I'm sure James will get into all the details of right away here. But I think what we really like about this is front and center, that message is the Change for Climate initiative and is really tied to the City of Edmonton. And then also there's many, many more points of information to come as, a homeowner explores their potential. But right off the cuff here, they see their next steps. So, the rebate and then also the list of solar installers should they just want to jump right into that.
Right. Yeah, again, thinking back to changing human behavior, I think it's one thing to sort of briefly consider how suitable your rooftop is, and this quick visual lets someone do that. But it's another to learn that there's support in sort of guiding you on your journey to actually getting solar installed. And we hope that by providing that information up front, it encourages folks to take the next step, which in this case is to really go a level deeper and explore the potential. So let's do that for your rooftop, Lisa. Do you still maintain the sort of beautiful looking garden that we can see there?
I've only lived here for 6 months, so ask me in a few months.
Okay, spring is around the corner, so we'll check back in. So immediately, what we're doing here to sort of supplement the visual solar shading on the boundary of the rooftop is to provide some quick statistics around the solar radiance and solar potential of the rooftop. So in this case, Lisa, your home has 1,246 hours of usable sunlight per year. And this is based on the aggregated solar radiance throughout all 4 seasons, taking into account local weather patterns, cloud cover, the percentage of time the sun is actually out and shining, etc. And through Google's sort of sophisticated 3D modeling, we're also able to tell you that there's 80 square meters available on your rooftop for solar panels. And this accounts for obstacles that may be on your roof, whether chimneys, for example. It accounts for nearby vegetation as well that might be overhanging or casting shade on the rooftop. So really, a couple quick statistics, and then we actually go a level further to expand on the rebate information provided by the city, and telling people that they could qualify for a rebate of up to $4,000, which, Lisa is really generous. I think is hopefully it's a strong motivator for folks in Edmonton to consider going solar.
Yeah, I think what I would just maybe add about that is it's a 40 cent per watt rebate. That's approximately 15% of the costs of the whole system here in our market. And so I would just say municipalities generally have a lot smaller budgets than provinces or the federal government. So I've seen much higher, but we certainly do think it's an effective and a responsible amount.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe before we get into the rooftop specifics here, what some people may be noticing is, we have a lot of these homes which have their solar potential mapped, but then there's a few additional buildings here which are most likely garages, which are not mapped. And so, this occasionally happens. This can be either that the building or the garage was constructed after Google acquired and processed the data for the region, or because, at its core, it's a pretty sophisticated algorithmic model which detects the rooftops, but it doesn't always catch 100% of rooftops in terms of delineating those as a separate structure. So in this case, Lisa, your garage is not actually mapped. And one of the things that we developed in partnership with you to really address some of these concerns was a quick way to inform people using this map that even though their garage may not be mapped with its solar potential, we've done some background work to help people understand that you could still install solar panels there, and it could actually still be a really good idea. So we built in this little modal here to really go a little bit above and beyond and let people know that even if their building isn't mapped, their garage isn't mapped, we could still, solar could still be a good option. So, Lisa, we worked on this kind of back and forth for a while, I know, and again, we really wanted to make this simple, easy to understand. As we talked about, folks will only take action if it's easy to understand. So we're really just asking two questions. How many cars does your garage accommodate? 1, 2, or 3, which is sort of indicative of the size. And then what's the orientation? So is it north-south? Is it east-west? Or the larger parts of that rooftop, which way do they face? So in the case of a north-south facing double garage, we're providing this estimate here that there's 1,460 hours of usable sunlight, 38 meters squared of space available, which would accommodate up to a 6 kilowatt system of 23 panels. So, I know this is something that we worked on. Hopefully this has been helpful in alleviating some of the concerns that you received from residents about missing garages.
Yeah, I would just say, we're trying to understand the scope of the challenge here. And I think when looking at I think we have something like 280 solar installations that have taken place since our rebate program began, and about 10% of them are on garages. Because, as you can see with my house, the potential of my garage would be much greater than my home, just given the lack of trees in the back alley there. But anecdotally, we hear from installers that sometimes as much as 30% of their work is garage installation. So we were really grateful that there was such a high profile intervention in a way that when folks are looking at their home, they don't discount if it doesn't have the potential they'd hoped, and can sort of guesstimate from their garage, and then also kind of talk to a professional about from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your case, as you mentioned, this kind of mature tree-lined street at the front of your house is throwing some shade over these buildings, as you can see in those darker purple areas. This particular building actually looks like it has a tree overhanging, and so you see that rooftop boundary is sort of adjusted to account for that dense vegetation. But then when you get to your alley in between the houses, there's really a noticeable sort of lack of any tall, mature trees, which means that these houses will actually click over to. You can see that south-facing part of the roof has a really great solar potential due to the lack of trees sort of casting any shade. So it's quite neat to see these examples. There's another tall tree there affecting sort of the boundary of those rooftops. So it's really neat to see that that the sort of 3D modeling can account for that. So the next step, for anyone reviewing a rooftop, the next step would be, okay, this is great. I have a roof. The sun is hitting it in these ways. I get X amount of hours of usable sunlight per year. But so what? The city mentioned something about a rebate. I really want to understand the financials to be able to sort of inform my next steps here. So in scrolling down, we provide people looking for their rooftop on this site with a brief input to tell us, what is their estimated monthly electricity bill usage to inform the sort of size of the solar array that they could consider to try and offset, a majority of that electricity used. So at $100 per month based on this particular rooftop, it's 110 meters squared available. We're actually recommending a 5.3 kilowatt system, which is about 21 panels. and providing even more information next regarding the financial benefits. So this is kind of where people get really excited, because often up until this point, I think it's a bit of a mystery as to maybe how much it will cost, and they're maybe unaware that the city has this kind of generous rebate of up to $4,000. So within our calculator here, we've taken into account lots of the local sort of variables that will be required to understand the financial payback, including the incentive, including the local electricity rates. And so for this particular home, 21 solar panel array, we've estimated it would cost them $11,000 upfront after incentives, which would equate to about 16 years of a payback period, which is equivalent to about $8,500 of savings over 25 years, which is what we estimate to be sort of the lifetime of the system. So really kind of very quickly, someone has a very good idea of what that might look like for their rooftop.
And just to confirm, James, that is at current energy prices, because I definitely think one of the challenges with a lot of our work is that energy is relatively very inexpensive in Alberta. And so that's sort of why even a smaller investment has such a long payback period.
Yes, yeah, based on current energy rates, and we definitely have the ability to account for changes in rates, account for changes in incentives, or even the program itself over time. That's sort of one of the nice things about this platform, is it can be fully customized on a local place-based approach, kind of as you alluded to earlier, to make sure that it's relevant to whoever is viewing it. And because we know that a lot of people are motivated by the environmental benefits of going solar as well, we also provide this estimate, in that in this case, this particular array over its lifetime would help avoid 66.8 tons of carbon dioxide, which is equivalent to over 1,100 trees grown for 10 years, and equivalent to about 14.4 cars taken off the road. And then ready to kind of close off someone's journey here, we've provided very quickly the visual potential for the rooftop, the financial and environmental benefits. Lisa, do you want to speak to sort of what people will be seeing here in this section?
Yeah, I think, again, there's some of that great messaging that I mentioned up front. That's hopefully somebody is inspired and excited by what they've learned and sort of wants to know what those next steps are, and trying to just be really clear about connecting them to the great resources such as Solar Alberta and the details about the rebate program.
Yeah. And this is where, again, we hope to get to changing behaviors, right? So making this whole process really easy and giving folks a direct call to action to continue their journey and to learn more. And so, in the earlier days of MyHEAT and the City of Edmonton working together on a solar map, this is sort of previous to this being powered by Google's Project Sunroof. The earlier platform that we had built for the city had a click-through rate on these sort of calls to action of about 17% of folks that were getting here and then choosing to take their next step. So that's pretty good. That's an industry average of click-through rates for calls to action, whether this be in ads or marketing, is typically much lower, maybe 4 to 6%. So 17% was good. And then since we refreshed the platform, Lisa, with Google's Project Sunroof technology, I think we've seen that click-through rate jump up to about 32%. So we're just shy of 1 in 3 folks getting to this page, then actually taking the next step to learn more, at least directly from this website. Which hopefully is translating to kind of more folks engaging with the city on this program, more folks signing up for the rebates that you make available. So maybe we'll quickly just review one more home example. I know, Lisa, you mentioned that your home is in a more mature neighborhood, and you can see a lot of these trees here. But if we were to look into sort of a newer neighborhood in this northwest part of the city, immediately we're seeing far fewer trees, in this residential area, far more sort of bright yellow rooftops owing to the lack of any tall vegetation. We can see some small trees in the sort of south part below this home, but really not tall enough to cast any shade that would hamper the ability of this rooftop. So, it's a really good example how even quickly and visually, you can assess different neighborhoods to different houses to different streets, and even take into account how vegetation plays a role. And and even maybe think about the opportunity for, urban reforestry, and even being able to visually use this as a guide to say, it would be a great idea to plant more trees here, but do we want them directly next to the houses to hamper the solar potential when we're also trying to get solar off the ground? We're not sure, right? So another sort of interesting example that we had come across previously. So maybe just in the interest of time, we'll sort of pause the screen share there. I have sort of another question or two for Lisa to wrap up this section. So sort of based on the work that we've done together, this platform, how folks can use it, I'd be curious to learn from your perspective about what are the ways that you're using data visualization tools like this to achieve the municipal climate goals, the pretty sort of aggressive and ambitious goals that the City of Edmonton has.
Yeah, I thought I might provide one more example. So data transparency and visualization is an integral part of our buildings efforts around greenhouse gas emissions reductions and energy efficiency. So, our colleagues on the call might be really familiar with this really common tool, benchmarking or building energy labeling, that's become really common globally, but more recently in North America. So good examples would be like New York or Boston or Philadelphia. And I know Philadelphia has a pretty incredible data visualization for theirs. But essentially, this is a tool that evaluates the energy efficiency of homes using something like EnerGuide, or benchmarks the energy performance of a building using Energy Star Portfolio Manager in North America. And really public disclosure of the outcomes of those evaluations and assessments is an essential data set to our work. So we've been hosting voluntary building energy labeling programs for homes and buildings since 2017. And really, the idea is to give access to that information to the market so that it can start to readily value energy efficient buildings and homes. Because right now it's fairly invisible. It's an impossible thing to value and to understand fully. So for example, we have a home energy map that has over 5,000 or almost 5,000 EnerGuide labels associated with homes. And we do intend to keep that going and even explore mandatory bylaws and whatnot in the future.
That's great. Yeah, a place like the United Kingdom has that sort of similar home and building labeling, which has been around for a number of years, and it's quite a powerful tool that people consider even when they're considering a new home to buy. So great to hear that you're doing that work.
Thank you.
Right. Well, thanks a lot, Lisa. This is a great discussion. Great to get sort of the on-the-ground approach and experience that you've had working with the City of Edmonton, and how sort of we work together to support your policies and programs. And hopefully we have much more continued success in the future. Now feels like a good time to pass it over to Nicole, my former colleague at Google, to expand on the Environmental Insights Explorer as we've sort of referenced it throughout. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Nicole. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, James. Thank you, Lisa. And I mean, huge congrats on such a wonderful, beautiful implementation of public-private partnership, bringing digital tech to be able to advance your renewable goals and targets for the City of Edmonton. And hello, all. It's so great to be here today. I'm Nicole Lombardo, and I lead our partnerships and go-to-market strategies here within the GEO organization at Google. I get the lucky job of being able to work with several governments around the world, working with our environmental data and insights. As a quick, we're going to do a quick intro, some context of sort of how we're helping and supporting governments like Edmonton and many more across Canada this year. And would love to obviously make sure we have enough time for Q&A, because it looks like there's some really great questions coming from the audience. But just to start, so I think many of you know Google as a company, strives to be sustainable in all the things that we do, be it in the ways that we operate our business, from creating efficient data centers, sustainable workplaces, building better devices and services. But we also are really committed to using our data and technology to empower how others can make more sustainable choices in their own lives, as well as how we can, accelerate smarter climate plans, policies, but further, as you're seeing here today, how we can accelerate low carbon solutions to market, which is really key and critical. So for today, I thought, share some really exciting things that we're doing and to support, some of the governments with our geographical data. It sounds like there's lots of fans here. So just to geek out on geodata, many of you, what you're seeing here is obviously some of our data at play. So when you think about Google Maps, usually you think about getting directions from point A to point B, or getting information on places you want to go. But, powering these maps, are insights about the places around us, and, information like the size of and location of buildings, our overhead imagery, and how we can actually aggregate things like our transportation data. And all of these sources are usually mostly to get us, from places across the city. But what we're finding now is they also contain really useful information for taking action towards a low carbon future. And so what I'm showing you here today is the visualization of actually the sun going up, over the head and going down. So for every hour of the day, we're capturing kind of where the sun hits every point of every building location. And what that gets you is the ability to estimate the solar potential of every home. So what, James and Lisa just showed you is just a wonderful implementation of this huge data set, but now in a more granular level, in the form of a solar tool. And so, for us, when we look at sort of how we, try to tackle one of the world's largest crises around climate, we obviously are focused on cities because we think they're one of the best, innovations and inventions where they bring people together on their ideas. But they're also the hubs of activity. And that's why we see well over 70% of the world's emissions coming from cities. It's how we live in our buildings and how we obviously get around from point A to point B. And so in 2018, we actually formed a foundational partnership with the Global Covenant of Mayors, who are working across cities around the world. And we found that well over 20% of cities today have been able to actually execute a comprehensive plan similar to what you heard from Edmonton. Many, many, many more cities today just haven't been able to get to that, namely because of some of the barriers. And we realize, we are all sort of operating in a state of urgency, so that we see this next 10 years, as being sort of the most important for us to really tackle some of the ways in which these cities can put together smarter policies around tackling climate. So last year, we stepped up our own ambition because we're seeing cities do it. We felt that as a company, it was important that we did it ourselves. And so one of our major commitments was to help well over 500 cities and local governments reduce a gigaton of emissions by 2030 and beyond. And that what we see is being able to use our technology and tools, which you saw some of the examples today, as a way to do that. And so we're really leaning in on this core mission and, excited to have share with you some of the ways we're doing this. So as I mentioned, when we first designed, went to do this, we decided what are some of the biggest barriers when you think about why many, many cities have not been able to progress on their climate plans. And what we found is that, across these 4 areas, whether it was data access, expertise in-house to be able to render sort of complex analysis from geospatial data, to then having people and staff and budgets to commit to the time. And so, we as a Google organization felt like this is a place where maybe we can lean in with our digital tech and ability with, being able to build tools that can help cities leapfrog some of these barriers in the future. So what you see here is sort of one of our first, it's sort of the home of where our environmental data sets sit. So including even the data that you just saw from Edmonton. So the Environmental Insights Explorer, EIE, it's freely accessible. It's online. It was helped, obviously built to help cities, obviously get over those constraints, as I mentioned before. And behind it, what we're doing is we're analyzing our maps data to provide these rich insights across buildings and also transport activity on the ground. And then we are able to take that activity data or seeing how many buildings are, and we apply emission factors that are able to give cities kind of a basic snapshot of sort of what's on the ground. And then further, once we've been able to sort of help cities address and understand sort of the largest sources of emissions that are activity that's contributing to those emissions, we next are hoping to then build insights that can help cities look at ways to reduce those emissions. And that's why you see, or avoid those emissions. And that's why you see the example here with rooftop solar and how Edmonton was able to sort of see pretty quickly what their full potential for solar was to then start to really act and implement programs around it. You all can actually jump on the site itself. I welcome you to. It's at insights.sustainability.google. We are really excited. We've made, in the past 4 years, have made major strides to provide greater access at scale to thousands of cities globally. And more importantly, it's wonderful to see like cities like Edmonton, other Canadian cities that have already started to embrace EIE in sort of the ways in which they're measuring emissions, monitoring emissions, or monitoring sort of the changes of activity on the ground, and then finally being able to sort of really start to see cities be able to rapidly see the results in their communities. And as we look at this year, real hope is to sort of expand access. So today the tool and data sets are available to well over 3,000 cities worldwide, and that we're hoping that we're just one step closer to kind of reaching our Giga 10 target with you all. And we're not done. We've just gotten started with this. We're making more investments to expand not just the data, underlying data, but to also expand the ways in which we're surfacing data. So just want to show you here that these are some of our newest areas, call it our labs, our EIE labs. We have 2 areas we're focused on looking at how we can provide more hyper-local measurement of air quality across city streets. And so we've been doing some pilots in different cities around the world. Another one, again, is looking at sort of urban heat island effects. And so, as I take a step back, it's not only how we're sort of helping cities measure and account for how things are changing on the ground from the sources of emissions, but then 2 is how do you start to reduce those, with those interventions that I just showed you with solar. And then finally, how do you help cities today tackle some of the challenges that are coming as a result of the climate changes? And so urban heat island, looking at solutions like tree canopy as a way to potentially over time protect vulnerable populations that are susceptible to extreme heat, increased temperatures. So I kind of hopefully wrapped it with a few good points here to just kind of help you show what we're doing. And I'd love to sort of turn it back to Allison for our Q&A session. Thank you.
Great. As you can see, we've only got 5 minutes to the hour. So what we're going to do is we're going to extend for an extra 10 minutes for any of you who can stay on so that we can hit as many of these questions that have come in. I've also taken some of the questions and tried to consolidate them. So you may not recognize your question exactly, but I've tried to mix them with ones that are similar. And we will also send out, I recognize most of the names here, so I'll send out an email with responses from either Google, MyHEAT, or the City of Edmonton to any questions that we weren't able to hit that are maybe, I might leave some of the ones that are more policy-based out so we can just really focus on the data visualization at this moment. There are some questions around, rights and requirements around net metering and restricting future solar potential and creating solar protection. I'm going to leave that to Edmonton to respond to afterwards, but they are pretty policy based and try to stick to more of the tools stuff. I'll start with one question here, which is, if we envision that we start to rely more and more on these tools and this data visualization for not just engagement, which is kind of how we're using it mostly right now, but more so for policy and programs, or even going forward to looking at how we measure impact. My one concern is that whether it's with MyHEAT or LightSpark or any of these other tools that cities are looking at using right now, is that there's the people aren't represented in the tools. So we have a lot of information around the macro environment and around the buildings themselves or transportation, but not as much around the demographics and people. So how do we center equity, knowing that this is a big goal for cities? How do we center equity if these tools become the ones that we're using for choice making and in our design? What do you think, Lisa?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great question. I'd be interested to see what other folks think about when it comes to these tools specifically. I know when it comes to our policies and programs, it's just such an incredibly important element. Like, if we don't take this opportunity to ensure a just transition, we just are going to further reinforce the inequalities and environmental racism that does happen and disproportionately affects some communities. So while it hasn't been like a major focus of the City of Edmonton to date, and Mark may want to elaborate, but it is, and we're very proud to say, a big part of our updated strategy going to council in a couple weeks time here. So for example, one of the strategies is actually a goal to eliminate energy poverty in Edmonton. So that's, I think, a really exciting and important thing. And if approved, we'll kind of work on, I think, in 2 ways. Integrating that justice and equity as a lens across the work we're doing is a goal. But I think from what I understand from other jurisdictions, you also need specific program and policy approaches to reach these different audiences. So like BC, Nova Scotia, they'll require, specific programs to reach these audiences and these goals.
Yeah, great. Do you want to add anything, Google or MyHEAT, in terms of how you guys are envisioning enhancing your tools to be more people-centered?
Yeah, I would add something there. I would say that with MyHEAT's flagship product, the thermal infrared heat loss map that we build, we have built and we're doing further development on integrating as an additional layer into our maps any sort of publicly available data set, such as census data, such as possibly the energy equity data, Allison, I know that you've been really close to, sort of layering that in with our maps so that it's one thing to be able to zone in on areas of high solar potential or high heat loss, where the neighborhoods might simply just be older neighborhoods with older buildings, but it's another to then add an additional lens and layer to that focuses on sort of eliminating energy poverty and saying, okay, well, these buildings are not really that energy efficient, and they also happen to be in communities who are already suffering disproportionately from energy equity issues. So if we're going to roll out a PACE program, if we're going to roll out other financial incentives, that's great. But typically you have a lot of folks who jump on those incentives who may already be sufficiently sort of well off to afford those upgrades and retrofit their homes, where you can have greater impact by actually targeting, adjusting your messaging, by adding in that sort of energy equity lens and layer. So that's work that we've done in the past. That's work that we continue to do. And it's kind of one of our 3 pillars in addressing energy literacy, energy poverty, and reducing energy consumption. So very much on our radar. And I think it's a really important work to be thinking about.
I love that. Energy literacy, energy poverty, energy consumption. That's awesome. And I'm really glad to hear that, because it's, really close to my heart and the work that I've been doing around energy justice. And I really think it's critical. And I think we are going to become so much more reliant on these tools. And so we can't have a bunch of different lenses. They all really need to be layered together so we can really see stuff. I'm going to ask another question. Does anybody else have anything else they want to say on the energy justice piece? Okay, I'm going to move on to one of the questions that was asked is whether or not this tool connects people to contractors. So what's the call to action once they have all this beautiful information around what their financial benefits are and their solar potential is? Is there a direct connection to an approved list of contractors? And have you set something like that up in other consumer protection measures?
Yeah, what I would say is, as I'm sure many of our colleagues have run into, like, we do have to be very conscientious about the city recommending specific contractors over others. So luckily, Solar Alberta and CanREA are 2 organizations that have lists of solar installers that have signed up for their codes of conduct. And so there is sort of consumer protection mechanisms within there. And we require that installers be from one of those 2 approved lists.
Perfect. And that CanREA, that's Canadian Renewable Energy Association. Is that a replacement for CanSIA, the Canadian Solar whatever installation?
Yeah.
Cool. So CanREA is the new acronym you need to know, and that would be Canadian wide. So cool. The other question that I had, so this is another thing around when do you stop and start with using this tool? So the tool shows the solar potential, it shows the financial benefits, but it doesn't necessarily show a homeowner the comparison between solar to other measures and which one is more cost effective or delivers more energy savings for them. How are we communicating to households on that basis?
I can take that, Mark, unless you would like to.
Go for it.
Yeah, I just thought, so, every jurisdiction seems to be taking a different approach, because it's an excellent point you're raising. Currently, our approach is we're really trying to encourage EnerGuide labels. So since 2017, this is a home energy evaluation that includes a certified advisor that comes to the home and models your home, and then gives you a renovation pathway. Now, it doesn't give you explicitly the cost savings, but it gives you the gigajoule savings of each of those specific actions. And so we really are trying to encourage that through rebates, and have since 2017, pretty significant rebates actually, to encourage the adoption of those. And then that gives homeowners hopefully that evidence about how their home's using energy. And then they compare the different options in their home, and then similarly to their solar potential and the kinds of, solar is is really effective in Alberta, considering our carbon intensive grid. So getting that local green electricity here has like a huge benefit to your carbon footprint, but you don't want to underestimate those necessary upgrades as well. And we really think Energet's a good tool for that.
And maybe I'll just chip in a little bit on this, and this I think is part of the sort of the evolution of our call them our energy plans or climate plans as we move forward, and really this move to a net zero target, if you want to call it that. But it does bring in this question around, you know, in the past we said, well, we need to get a certain percentage of reduction in emissions, and you know, that's sort of the end goal. And as we start to do that, one of the challenges is that then we are sort of picking and choosing some of these things that may reduce emissions, but also lock us into emissions in the future. So I think this is some of the challenges that we need to be thinking about too on as we move, move our programs forward. And again, so that's, one lens. There's the equity lens that's coming in. I would say that a lot of previous programs that we've run, and probably similar across the country and across North America, have been very focused on those early adopters.
Yeah.
That those that can either afford it or are willing to move on things, and sort of challenges now. Well, how do we bring everybody in and bring everybody in equitably? So I throw that out more as a challenge, and I think one of our challenging pieces as we go to implement our net zero plan as we move forward, or our net zero plans. We'll speak for everybody across the country.
So I have a slightly technical question. It's probably for you, James. So one of the questions came in from somebody from Calgary who has said that their house is in an area serviced by NMAX and they don't provide net metering. So has the tool considered and incorporated the fact that some parts of the city may or may not be, somebody who's on EPCOR, for instance, versus somebody who's on NMAX may or may not have net metering? Or is that an issue in Edmonton, Lisa?
So yeah, I'm a bit surprised to hear that, because my understanding is under the microgeneration regulation, which guides this work through our provincial government. There's obligations that your utility has to set up like a bidirectional meter, so that folks can have folks can have a solar installation on their home. So I'm not familiar with that specifically. That's not feedback I've gotten from citizens in Edmonton. I'm not sure if anyone else has any insights there.
I'll add maybe it's a good question. It's definitely a factor to consider. If there are multiple providers within a given area, they can have different programs. They can have different net metering rates or structures, or one could be tiered, one could be flat. And so that is work that we are sort of actually actively doing. So it's a timely question to expand on the functionality of the calculators. So what you saw today with the City of Edmonton was a sort of fairly simple, straightforward net metering calculator, just a single calculator with a microgeneration sort of credit built into that. The work that we're doing now is actually to expand on that to facilitate, let's say within one single municipal boundary where there are multiple energy providers with different structures, to be able to then select the provider that is giving you your electricity, and then the output from the calculator will change and will take into account some of those factors, which may differ from provider to provider.
Great. Nicole, I'm going to ask a quick question to you, because there's a lot of question here about, like, now everybody's seeing all the different potential, and they're also seeing the potential for overlap. So how do we envision saying, okay, you've got your solar potential, then you've also got the tree canopy data that you're going to be providing. A lot of cities are also looking at urban heat island effect. So how do you see cities being able to use all of these things in thinking about, like, how the tree canopy is going to grow in the future, where we need more trees, for instance, where we need those nature-based solutions Mark's talking about?
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, one of the challenging things, of course, is building a tool that's relevant to, tens of thousands of cities worldwide that all have very different, environments and such. And so our whole aim was to just be able to provide the information, provide the insights, and allow the cities to make decisions and scenarios, and kind of make that sort of those to weigh their sort of options, because I think that, at the end of the day, what you set as targets today may change in 10 years, but the fact of the matter is being able to give you a pretty good line of sight of what are your options. So today EIE does give you the ability to kind of compare sort of the solar potential, but then it also at some point soon could also give you that sort of full canopy layer to show you where are trees and sort of making those choices. So it's not an easy job. This is a part I think about being in city government that's super challenging on deciding what is the biggest bang for your buck and what's going to provide the most benefit back to the community. So we see our jobs as just being able to provide the insights, the information, in the hopes that it just empowers these governments to have confidence, which, based on data and science.
Great. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think is going to be really, really, really interesting and really valuable to cities is, as I'm looking at, we have our energy poverty mapping and all of our data from 2016 census. The 2021 census is going to come out soon. Somebody's going to give me a lot of money so that we can actually, mine that data and create our new energy poverty maps for 2021. And then we have a time series to do comparison of, and we can start to look at impact measurement in a real way. And some of the stuff that's coming out from Google, like 2020 transportation data, is coming out 3 months after the fact. We'll never replicate that in local government. And so that's amazing that we might actually have a place where we can really be doing timely evaluation of whether or not programs have been impactful and whether or not we're having, if we're getting to that North Star of our 2050 targets or our 2030 targets. James, we're going to end it here. Give us, there's a couple questions here around like, okay, so how do we get this? Give me my mapping. I want this.
Yeah, for sure. So for our solar map, you can go to solar.myheat.ca or just search MyHEAT Solar. And we have our thermal infrared heat loss maps on there as well. So just a quick Google search.
And do you see, like, is the model for MyHEAT working with one city at a time, or is there a bigger play here with the federal government and trying to actually just layer the whole of the country? Or at least
like some of the recent announcements from the Canadian federal government with regard to some of the funding that they're making available for energy efficiency, and to an extent that can include renewable as well. That would be sort of an ideal scenario, but those things can take time. So for us, we do work on the individual city basis. I think particularly on the solar side, but also in heat. There's definitely economies of scale. So if there's sort of a regional alliance, let's say it's the likes of a CUSP or a TAF or a Quest or different kind of working groups across the country that have a collective sort of interest, the economies of scale kick in, and that makes it easier to get projects off the ground for sure. But we're open to sort of any and all conversations to try and find something that works.
Excellent. And I will say that we do have, FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, who is a formal advocate for municipalities, does have a brand new policy statement that they are shopping around to the ministers at this very moment in advance of the budget and of the new NDC, which reads: the federal government should support evidence-based decision-making at the local level that contributes to the goal of achieving net zero by 2050. For instance, by improving access to energy and greenhouse gas emissions data and reporting, developing net zero carbon budgeting tools, and providing resources and capacity building to help municipalities develop and implement local net zero pathways. That basically is, to me, like, that is a call to action for data and data visualization tools like this, and taking it off the backs of cities to provide these on a more global or national basis, and to be working directly with a lot of these platforms. Thank you so much for all your time. And Nicole, James, of course, to my friends, Lisa and Mark, thank you so much for your time. And behind the scenes, Dusty, I really appreciate as well your production of this. Guys, have a great day.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.